A struggling swimmer is pulled from the depths by an unexpected savior. The dolphin's incredible motive leaves everyone questioning the bond between humans and nature. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun beat down on Malibu Beach as Max adjusted his swim goggles. The water stretched before him like a vast blue canvas, deceptively calm despite the warnings his coach Steve had given him about training alone. The competition was just weeks away, and Max felt the weight of preparation heavy on his shoulders. "Remember what I always say," Steve had told him during their last session, his weathered face serious beneath his baseball cap. "The ocean isn't a swimming pool. You need to respect its power." Max had nodded, though he'd heard this speech countless times before. He was a strong swimmer, one of the best in the county, and he'd trained in these waters since he was 13. Standing at the water's edge, Max ran through his training plan. 3 miles out and back, with interval sprints every quarter mile. The routine was familiar, almost mechanical. As he waded into the cool water, he caught sight of his sister Lily watching from her usual spot on the beach. She sat under a striped umbrella, pretending to read, but actually keeping an eye on him. Her presence was both comforting and irritating. Max began his warm-up strokes, cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. His mind wandered to the upcoming Pacific Coast Championships. Second place last year hadn't been good enough. Not for him, not for his sponsors, and certainly not for his father, who hadn't even bothered to show up. This year had to be different. The water grew choppier as he pushed further from shore, but Max maintained his rhythm. Stroke, breath, stroke. He'd done this hundreds of times. The familiar burn began in his shoulders, but he pushed through it. Champions didn't stop when they got tired. Lily's worried face flashed in his mind. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she'd said at breakfast that morning. "There are other ways to prove yourself." She didn't understand. Swimming wasn't just about proving himself. It was who he was. In the water, everything made sense. Everything except the growing distance between him and his family. The first mile marker buoy passed by his left side. Max increased his pace, focusing on the power of each pull through the water. The sun disappeared behind a cloud, and a cool breeze rippled across the surface. Something felt different, but he couldn't place what it was. That's when he noticed the pull. Subtle at first, like a gentle tug on his legs. Max adjusted his stroke, compensating for the drift, but the current grew stronger. Each forward stroke seemed to move him sideways instead. The familiar coastline began to look wrong. Too far away, too small. Panic fluttered in his chest, but Max forced it down. He was experienced. He knew what to do. Turn parallel to the shore, swim across the current. Basic safety. But as he shifted his direction, the pull intensified. His powerful strokes barely made headway against the force of the water. The current grabbed him like a giant hand, dragging him further out to sea. Max's heart hammered against his ribs as he fought against the invisible force. Every training session, every victory, every moment of confidence meant nothing against the raw power of the ocean. Steve's words echoed in his head. Respect its power. Fear crept in as his muscles began to burn. The shore looked impossibly distant now, and his arms felt like lead. Each wave seemed determined to push him under, to fill his lungs with salt water instead of air. Max had never felt so small, so helpless against the vastness of the ocean. The current pulled him sideways, spinning him around until he lost all sense of direction. Exhaustion set in, and for the first time in his life, Max wondered if his P.S.I.on for swimming would be his undoing. As another wave crashed over his head, he realized with terrible clarity that his sister's fears hadn't been unfounded after all. Through the chaos of waves and currents, a sleek gray form cut through the water beside Max. At first, his oxygen-deprived brain registered it as a threat. Shark was his first panic thought. But the creature's movements were different, more graceful, deliberate. A dorsal fin broke the surface, and Max recognized the distinctive shape of a dolphin. The animal circled him once, then twice, its presence oddly calming despite Max's dire situation. This wasn't just any dolphin. This was Sammy, though Max's exhausted mind couldn't make the connection to their past encounter. The dolphin's skin gleamed silver gray in the filtered sunlight, scarred near the tail fin from an old injury that would have triggered Max's memory if he weren't fighting for his life. Sammy approached cautiously, reading the human's distress with an intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. The dolphin positioned itself alongside Max, nudging him with its bottlenose. The touch was gentle but insistent, like a friend trying to guide him in a specific direction. Max felt the firm pressure of Sammy's body against his side. The dolphin was trying to support him, to push him towards safety, but the current fought against their combined efforts. Waves crashed over them both, and Max struggled to keep his head above water. His arms felt like concrete, each movement requiring more energy than he could spare. Salt water burned his throat as he gasped for air. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Max had always thought drowning would be peaceful, like drifting off to sleep, but there was nothing peaceful about this. His body screamed for oxygen, his muscles seized with fatigue, and panic clawed at his chest like a living thing. Sammy persisted, refusing to leave Max's side. The dolphin's powerful tail drove against the current, creating a small pocket of calmer water that Max could use to catch his breath. But even Sammy struggled against the ocean's power. The current pulled them both further from shore, though the dolphin fought against it with everything it had. Through the haze of exhaustion, Max found himself drawing strength from Sammy's presence. Here was this creature, this stranger, fighting to save his life with a determination that defied explanation. Every time Max's arms felt too heavy to lift, every time his legs threatened to stop kicking, Sammy would nudge him again, as if saying, "Don't give up." The dolphin's efforts were taking their toll. Max could see Sammy's sides heaving with exertion, could feel the tremors running through the powerful body whenever they made contact. Still, the animal didn't abandon him. Something deep inside Max responded to this unwavering loyalty, even if he couldn't understand its source. Time lost all meaning in their struggle against the sea. Seconds stretched into eternities as Max fought to keep moving, to keep breathing. His world narrowed to the rhythm of Sammy's movements beside him, the periodic touch of smooth skin against his arm, the splash of the dolphin's tail driving them forward. Each time a wave threatened to push Max under, Sammy would be there, lifting him back to the surface. The dolphin's presence became an anchor, something real to hold on to in the chaos of wind and water. Max found himself timing his breaths to Sammy's surfacing, establishing a pattern that helped him conserve what little energy he had left. But even with Sammy's help, Max's strength was failing. His muscles trembled with fatigue, and each breath came in ragged gasps. The shore remained a distant blur, seemingly as far away as when their struggle began. Dark thoughts crept in. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended, despite all his training, despite Sammy's heroic efforts. The dolphin seemed to sense Max's despair. With renewed vigor, Sammy pressed against him, nearly lifting him out of the water with each surge forward. The determination in those actions sparked something in Max's fading consciousness. If this animal refused to give up on him, how could he give up on himself? As Max fought alongside Sammy, his oxygen-deprived mind suddenly flashed back to a different day, 3 years earlier. The memory hit him with startling clarity. A cloudy morning, the beach empty except for early joggers, and the sound that had caught his attention, distressed clicks and splashing near the pier. That day, 17-year-old Max had been doing his usual morning run when he spotted something thrashing in the shallow waters. A young dolphin had become entangled in an abandoned fishing net, its tail and dorsal fin wrapped tight in synthetic mesh. Without thinking, Max had waded into the cold water, his heart pounding with urgency rather than fear. The memory played out in vivid detail. The dolphin's frightened eyes, intelligent and desperate. The way it had initially thrashed harder when Max approached, then gradually calmed as if sensing his intention to help. Max had worked methodically, his fingers trembling as he untangled the cutting mesh from the dolphin's skin, speaking in low, soothing tones the entire time. "Easy there, buddy," he'd whispered, working strand by strand. "I've got you." The dolphin had remained surprisingly still, only occasionally twitching when Max's fingers brushed against raw skin where the net had cut in. It had taken nearly an hour of careful work, his hands growing numb from the cold water, but Max had refused to leave until every last strand was removed. The moment of freedom was etched in his memory. The dolphin had turned to look at him, its eye meeting his with an almost human intelligence. Then it had circled him once, close enough to touch, before swimming away. Max had noticed the distinctive pattern of scars the net had left near its tail, never imagining he'd see those same marks again. Back in the present, fighting against the current, Max's mind made the connection. The same scars, the same intelligent eyes. Sammy was that dolphin. The realization hit him with the force of a wave. This wasn't just any dolphin trying to save him. This was the same creature he'd helped years ago, returning the favor in his moment of need. The memory seemed to give both of them renewed strength. Max's movements synced more naturally with Sammy's now, understanding flowing between them like an electric current. Each push against the water became more coordinated, more purposeful. The shore was still distant, but something had changed in their dynamic. Max remembered how gentle he'd had to be while removing the net, how careful to avoid causing more damage. Now Sammy showed the same careful consideration, supporting him without pushing too hard, guiding him without overwhelming his exhausted body. The parallel wasn't lost on Max, even in his exhausted state. Their previous encounter had lasted less than an hour, yet had clearly left an impression on both of them. Max had often thought about that dolphin over the years, wondering if it had survived, if the scars had healed. He'd never imagined their paths would cross again, let alone in such dramatic circumstances. The beach seemed to grow slightly larger on the horizon, though Max couldn't be sure if it was progress or hallucination. His muscles screamed for rest, but the memory of his past encounter with Sammy gave him a second wind. If he'd had the strength to help then, he needed to find the strength to keep fighting now. Sammy's clicks and whistles seemed more urgent now, as if the dolphin was trying to communicate something specific. Max forced his tired mind to focus on the present, on the subtle changes in the water's movement around them. The current was still strong, but different somehow. Perhaps they were finally reaching its edge. Through the haze of exhaustion, Max felt a shift in the W. A tear's pull. Sammy seemed to sense it too, adjusting their trajectory slightly. The dolphin's movements became more decisive, more directed. They were either making progress or being pulled into an even more dangerous situation. Max couldn't tell which, but he trusted Sammy's instincts. The final push toward shore came with a suddenness that caught Max off guard. The current's grip loosened, like a rubber band snapping, and suddenly he and Sammy were moving more freely through the water. Max's feet brushed against sand, and relief flooded through him with such force that his legs nearly gave out. Sammy stayed with him until the water was too shallow, giving one final, gentle push before backing away into deeper water. Max stumbled the last few yards, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He collapsed onto the wet sand, coughing up seawater, his chest heaving with each desperate breath. The sound of running footsteps approached, and then Lily was there, dropping to her knees beside him. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands shook as she touched his shoulder, as if making sure he was real. She'd been watching the entire ordeal from shore, helpless to do anything but call for help. "Mux!" "Oh, God, Max," she choked out, pulling him into a fierce hug despite his soaked state. I saw you getting pulled out and I couldn't. The lifeguards were on their way, but you were so far out." Her words tumbled out in a rush of relief and lingering fear. Max wanted to reassure her, to explain what had happened, but his throat was raw from salt water, and his body felt like lead. He managed to lift his head enough to look out at the water, searching for Sammy. The dolphin was still there, surfacing periodically, its dorsal fin visible against the waves. Lily followed his gaze, her expression shifting from relief to confusion. "That dolphin," she said slowly. "It was helping you. I saw it from shore, but I couldn't believe." She trailed off, shaking her head. "How is that possible?" Max tried to speak, coughed, and tried again. Remember that dolphin I told you about? The one in the fishing net?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It's the same one, Lily. It's Sammy." Lily stared at him like he'd lost his mind, probably wondering if the lack of oxygen had affected his brain. "Max, that was years ago. There's no way." But even as she spoke, Sammy breached the surface, showing the distinctive scarring that proved Max's words. A small crowd had gathered now. Curious beachgoers, the newly arrived lifeguards, and several people with phones out, recording the unusual scene. Max barely noticed them. His focus remained on Sammy, who continued to patrol the area as if making sure he was truly safe. "You don't understand," Max managed, sitting up with Lily's help. "It recognized me. It knew exactly what to do." He could see the skepticism in his sister's eyes, the same look she got whenever he talked about his connection to the ocean. But this time, there was something else there too, a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even acceptance. The lifeguards approached with questions, medical equipment, and concerned expressions. Max answered automatically, describing the current that had caught him, careful to emphasize Sammy's role in his rescue. One of them radioed for marine wildlife experts, but Max knew they wouldn't find anything unusual about the dolphin, except for its extraordinary act of reciprocal kindness. Lily stayed close, her hand on his shoulder, as if afraid he might disappear again. Her earlier anger about his reckless training schedule seemed forgotten, replaced by a new appreciation for both his skills and his limitations. "I still don't understand," she said softly. "Of all the dolphins in the ocean, how did this one find you?" Max watched as Sammy made one final leap, water streaming from its sleek body, before disappearing into deeper waters. "Maybe some connections go deeper than we can understand," he replied, his voice stronger now. "Sometimes you just have to accept the miracle without questioning it." 2 weeks later, Max stood before a group of wide-eyed children at Malibu Beach's monthly Marine Education Day. The morning sun warmed his back as he faced his young audience, their faces expectant and curious. He'd traded his competitive swimming gear for more casual attire, but the ocean still called to him, its rhythmic waves providing a backdrop to his words. "The ocean isn't just water," Max began, his voice carrying across the small amphitheater created by beach chairs and towels. "It's home to countless creatures, each one with its own story, its own intelligence, its own importance." The children sat cross-legged in the sand, some fidgeting, others completely still, all attention focused on him. Max had never considered himself a public speaker, but his recent experience had given him something powerful to share. He told them about marine conservation, about the dangers of abandoned fishing nets, about the importance of respecting the ocean's power. But mostly, he told them about Sammy. "Sometimes," he explained, watching their faces light up with wonder, "the kindness you show comes back to you in ways you never expect." He described finding Sammy trapped in the net, careful to balance the reality of the situation with sensitivity to his young audience. Then he told them about his own rescue, about how Sammy had appeared exactly when he needed help most. As if on cue, a familiar dorsal fin broke the surface beyond the breaking waves. The children gasped and pointed, some jumping to their feet in excitement. Sammy had been making regular appearances since the rescue, as if checking on Max, but this timing seemed almost deliberate. The dolphin began a series of spectacular leaps and turns, drawing exclamations of delight from the crowd. Parents reached for their phones to record the display, but Max noticed that most of the children simply watched, their faces filled with pure joy and amazement. "Sammy is teaching us something important," Max continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the excited chatter. "Every creature in the ocean is worth protecting. Every act of kindness matters, even if we don't see the results right away." The event organizers had set up educational stations along the beach, tables with information about marine life, conservation efforts, and ocean safety. Max saw children dragging their parents from table to table, asking questions, examining the displays with new interest. His story had sparked something in them, a connection to the ocean that went beyond summer fun and beach days. One small girl raised her hand, her face serious beneath her sun hat. "But weren't you scared?" she asked. "When the ocean tried to pull you away?" Max considered her question carefully. "Yes," he admitted. "I was very scared, but that's another lesson Sammy taught me. It's okay to be scared, and it's okay to need help sometimes. The ocean deserves our respect, but it doesn't have to be our enemy. More hands shot up, more questions followed. The children wanted to know everything. How dolphins breathe, why they help humans, whether Sammy had a family. Max answered what he could, grateful for the marine biology courses he'd taken in school, and honest about what he didn't know. Throughout the session, Sammy continued to put on a show offshore, as if understanding its role in the day's events. The dolphin's presence added authenticity to Max's words, turning what could have been just another cautionary tale into something magical and real. Parents began approaching Max after the formal presentation, sharing their own stories of ocean encounters, asking about conservation efforts they could support. He directed them to legitimate organizations, emphasized the importance of teaching water safety alongside appreciation for marine life. The event lasted well into the afternoon, but Max noticed something remarkable. Not a single child left early. They remained engaged, curious, and increasingly passionate about protecting the ocean and its inhabitants. He saw his own childhood love for the sea reflected in their eyes, untarnished by competition or pressure to prove themselves. The success of the Marine Education Day made the announcement that followed a week later even more devastating. Max first heard about it during a morning training session with Steve, who handed him a copy of the local newspaper with a grim expression. Malibu Shores Resort Development approved, the headline declared. Below it, architectural renderings showed a massive complex stretching across the coastline. Exactly where Max had nearly lost his life. Exactly where Sammy now regularly appeared. They're planning to build right over the marine sanctuary, Steve explained, his weathered face creased with concern. Private beach access, yacht marina, the works. They've been pushing this through quietly for months. He pointed to a paragraph detailing the economic benefits, jobs, tourism, tax revenue. Max scanned the article, his stomach tightening with each detail. The development would require extensive dredging of the nearshore area, disrupting the delicate ecosystem that supported not just Sammy, but countless other marine species. The public beach where he held his educational sessions would become private property. There has to be something we can do, Max said, looking out at the pristine shoreline that would soon be transformed by construction equipment. Steve nodded, pulling out his phone to show Max a message from local environmental groups already organizing opposition. At the first community meeting, Max found himself face-to-face with James Richardson, the lead developer. Richardson stood at the podium in an expensive suit, presenting slick visualizations of the proposed resort while speaking about progress and economic growth. His confidence seemed to fill the room, making the concerns of local residents sound small and provincial in comparison. When Max raised his hand to speak about the marine ecosystem, Richardson cut him off with practiced ease. "Young man, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this project has already undergone all required environmental impact studies. We have experts, real experts, who have signed off on every aspect." The dismissal stung, but it was Richardson's condescending smile that really got under Max's skin. He tried again, standing up despite the developer's attempt to move on. "Those experts haven't seen what I've seen. This area is vital to dash." "To what?" Richardson interrupted. "A few fish? Some dolphins that can easily relocate? We're talking about bringing hundreds of jobs to this community. Real benefits, not fairy tales about friendly dolphins." The room erupted in mixed reactions, some applauding Richardson's practical approach, others protesting his dismissal of environmental concerns. Max remained standing, his face burning, but his resolve strengthening. He caught Steve's eye across the room, receiving a subtle nod of encouragement. Later, outside the community center, Max joined a group of environmental activists who had been taking notes during the meeting. They introduced themselves as members of various conservation organizations, each bringing different expertise to the fight. "We need someone like you," said Sarah Chun, a marine biologist who had studied the local ecosystem for years. "Someone who can make people understand what we're really losing. Numbers and studies are important, but your story, your connection with Sammy, that's something people can relate to." Max hesitated, remembering Richardson's dismissal. "They didn't seem very interested in my story in there." "That's because Richardson and his people are scared of stories like yours," Steve interjected, joining the group. They can argue with data, but they can't argue with the kind of connection why. OUV's shown people. That's why they try to shut you down so quickly. The group began planning their response: legal challenges, public awareness campaigns, peaceful protests. Max found himself becoming more involved than he'd ever imagined, learning about environmental law, marine ecology, and community organizing. But Richardson's team was powerful and well-funded. For every move the environmental group made, the developers seemed to have a counter prepared. They began running their own ads, portraying the protesters as anti-progress extremists who cared more about animals than people's livelihoods. The morning of the beach protest dawned clear and warm. Max arrived early to find people already gathering: families with children, surfers, marine biologists, and local residents. Many carried handmade signs: "Save our sanctuary," "Dolphins before dollars," "No resort in our waters." The crowd grew steadily, spreading across the beach like a human tide. Local news vans pulled into the parking lot, cameras and microphones at the ready. Max had spent weeks organizing this event, coordinating with environmental groups, securing permits, and preparing for media coverage. He spotted Lily setting up a social media command center under a tent, her laptop surrounded by volunteers ready to broadcast the event live. "We've got over 500 people confirmed," Lily reported, her initial skepticism about Max's cause long forgotten. She had become one of his strongest supporters, using her marketing expertise to spread their message. And look at this. #SaveSammySanctuary is trending locally. The protest had been carefully planned to be both impactful and peaceful. Marine biology students set up educational stations along the beach, similar to the Marine Education Day, but now focused on showing exactly what the resort development would destroy. Underwater photographers displayed stunning images of the local marine life, including several of Sammy and his pod. Max felt the weight of responsibility as he prepared to address the crowd. This wasn't just about one dolphin anymore. It was about protecting an entire ecosystem. The developers had tried to paint him as a naive young activist, but months of research and preparation had given him confidence in their cause. "They think we're just a bunch of beach-loving dreamers," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "They're right about one thing: we do love this beach. We love the life it sustains, the joy it brings, the lessons it teaches." The crowd grew quiet, listening intently. "But they're wrong about everything else. We're not against progress. We're for sustainable development that respects both human needs and natural habitats. We're not choosing animals over people. We're choosing a future where both can thrive." As if on cue, several dorsal fins appeared beyond the breakers. The crowd gasped and cheered as Sammy and several other dolphins began their familiar acrobatic display. Cameras turned toward the water, capturing the moment that seemed to perfectly illustrate Max's words. The energy of the protest grew throughout the day. Local artists created sand sculptures depicting marine life. Children led a cleanup parade, collecting trash from the beach while chanting "Save Our Sea." Marine biology students gave impromptu lectures about the complex ecosystem that the development would disrupt. But the developers weren't going down without a fight. A counter-protest formed at the edge of the beach. Construction workers and local business owners who had been promised jobs and economic opportunities. They carried their own signs: "Progress, not propaganda," and "Jobs matter too." The tension between the groups was palpable, but Max had prepared for this. He approached the counter-protesters, offering to hear their concerns. "We're not trying to take away opportunities," he explained. "We're trying to find a better way forward, one that creates jobs without destro. In what makes this place special." Some listened, others turned away. But the media captured every interaction, and Max could see the narrative shifting. This wasn't environmental activists versus jobs anymore. It was a community trying to find balance between progress and preservation. The pressure on the developers intensified as more media coverage highlighted the unique marine ecosystem at stake. Experts who had initially signed off on the environmental impact studies began to publicly question their findings. Local politicians, sensing the shift in public opinion, started distancing themselves from the project. As the sun began to set, Max stood at the water's edge, watching Sammy's pod still playing in the waves. The protest had exceeded his expectations, but he knew this was just one battle in a longer war. The developers had money and influence on their side. All he had was a story about a dolphin and a growing army of people who believed in protecting something precious. The protest's impact reverberated far beyond Malibu's shores. By the next morning, national news networks had picked up the story, drawn by the compelling imagery of dolphins appearing during the demonstration. Local footage of Sammy's aerial display went viral, catching the attention of major environmental documentarians. Clara Martinez, an award-winning nature filmmaker, arrived with her crew within days of the protest. "There's something special happening here," she explained to Max as they walked along the shoreline. "It's not just about development versus conservation anymore. This story is about connection between species, between communities, between people and place." The documentary team set up their equipment just as Sammy made another appearance. Their cameras captured the dolphin's now familiar scarring in stunning clarity, validating Max's account of their first encounter. Marine biologists on the team confirmed that dolphins could indeed recognize and remember specific humans, lending scientific credibility to Max's experience. "What we're seeing here is extraordinary," Dr. Sarachin explained to the documentary crew, pointing out the consistent patterns in Sammy's visits. "This isn't random behavior. This dolphin is deliberately maintaining contact with this specific location and these specific people. Disrupting this habitat wouldn't just destroy an ecosystem. It would break a unique bond that deserves scientific study." The media presence drew more attention to the technical aspects of the development plan. Environmental engineers began questioning the developers' impact assessments, particularly regarding the proposed marina's effect on local currents, the same currents that had nearly claimed Max's life. During one filming session, a reporter approached Max for what he expected to be another standard interview. Instead, she asked, "Have you seen today's financial news? The resort's primary investors are getting nervous. Your story is affecting their stock prices." Max hadn't planned on becoming the face of a movement, but he found himself handling interviews with increasing confidence. He stuck to the facts, emphasized the science, but wasn't afraid to share the emotional core of his connection with Sammy. The combination proved powerful, especially when the dolphin would appear during filming, as if understanding its role in the narrative. The documentary crew captured everything: the community meetings, the scientific surveys, the daily life of the beach that would be forever altered by development. They interviewed local families who had witnessed Sammy's rescue of Max, surfers who had seen the dolphin pod's behavior change since the development announcement, and marine biologists who explained the broader implications of disrupting this specific ecosystem. But it was the footage of Sammy interacting with children during educational programs that proved most compelling. The dolphins seemed to deliberately approach the Shah, lows during these sessions, engaging in behavior that the documentary's marine mammal experts described as unusually social and demonstrative. "Look at this," Clara said one evening, showing Max footage from that day's shoot. "When the children are present, Sammy's pod stays closer to shore. They're more active, more demonstrative. It's almost like they're putting on a show, trying to communicate something." The media attention brought additional scrutiny to the development project itself. Investigative reporters began digging into the corporate structure behind the resort plan, following paper trails and questioning permissions that had seemed secure just weeks before. Through it all, Max maintained his daily routine of swimming and teaching, though now usually accompanied by cameras. The documentary captured his early morning training sessions, often featuring Sammy swimming parallel to his route, as if providing protection against the currents that had nearly taken his life. "Your story resonates because it's authentic," Clara told him after a particularly powerful day of filming. "You're not just talking about saving a place, you're showing people why it needs to be saved. Every time Sammy appears, it reinforces everything you're fighting for." Despite the growing support and media attention, Max found himself lying awake at night, wrestling with doubts. The pressure of being the movement's public face weighed heavily on him. Every interview, every public appearance, every decision carried the weight of potential consequences not just for him, but for the entire campaign. One morning, his phone buzzed with a text from Jake Martinez, his contact at the Los Angeles Times. "Check your email. You want to see this." The message contained internal documents from the resort development company, showing that they were struggling to maintain investor confidence. Several major backers had quietly withdrawn their support, citing public relations concerns. Max should have felt triumphant, but instead, anxiety gnawed at him. He sat on the beach, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of pink and gold. The same waters that had nearly claimed his life now seemed to hold the fate of an entire community in balance. "You look like you're carrying the whole ocean on your shoulders," Lily said, settling into the sand beside him. She'd become more than just a supportive sister. She was now his closest advisor, helping manage the overwhelming flow of media requests and supporter communications. "What if we're wrong?" Max asked quietly. "The developers keep talking about jobs, about economic growth. What if stopping this project actually hurts the community?" The question had been haunting him, especially after seeing the desperate faces of the counter-protesters at their last rally. Lily was quiet for a moment, watching the waves. "Remember what Dr. Chen said? It's not about stopping development. It's about finding the right kind of development. One that creates opportunities without destroying what makes this place special." Their conversation was interrupted by a notification on Max's phone. The developers had issued a new statement, claiming that environmental concerns were being exaggerated for dramatic effect. They'd hired their own marine biology experts who argued that the dolphin population would adapt to the changes, finding new territories. "They're missing the point," Max said, frustration rising in his voice. "It's not just about whether the dolphins can survive somewhere else. It's about recognizing that some places deserve to be preserved exactly as they are." The pressure intensified when local business owners began receiving calls from the development company, promising exclusive contracts if they publicly supported the resort. Some longtime supporters of the conservation effort began to waver, torn between environmental concerns and economic opportunities. Max's doubt reached its peak during a community forum, where he faced aggressive questioning from resort supporters. "Who are you to stand in the way of progress?" one man demanded. "You're just a kid with a fish story. People need jobs more than they need to watch dolphins play." The words stung, especially because they echoed his own private fears. That night, he returned to the beach alone, walking along the shoreline where he'd first encountered Sammy years ago. The moon cast a silver path across the water, and the sound of waves provided a steady rhythm for his troubled thoughts. As if sensing his distress, a familiar dorsal fin broke the surface. Sammy's appearance, as it had so many times before, helped put things in perspective. This wasn't just about jobs versus environment or progress versus preservation. It was about finding a way to progress that respected the intricate web of connections that made this place unique. His phone buzzed again, another message from Jake. The investor exodus had sparked an emergency board meeting at the development company. Sources suggested that the project might be temporarily suspended for reassessment. It should have been good news, but Max felt the weight of responsibility even more heavily. The revelation came during the emergency town hall meeting called to discuss the resort project suspension. Max sat in the front row, preparing to address the gathered crowd, when James Richardson himself walked onto the stage. Something about the developer's demeanor was different. Gone was the slick confidence, replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Before we begin," Richardson said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "there's something I need to share." He paused, looking directly at Max. 20 years ago, I was a different person with different dreams. I was a marine biology student, spending my days studying dolphin behavior right here in these waters. The room fell silent. Max felt his heart pounding as Richardson continued. "I had a wife who shared my passion, and a young son who loved the ocean as much as we did." His voice cracked slightly. "We lost her to cancer when our boy was just 3 years old. I couldn't bear to stay in this place without her, couldn't face the ocean that had been our home. So I left, leaving my son with his aunt, reinventing myself as someone who could bury grief under concrete and steel." Max's world tilted on its axis as understanding dawned. The photographs in his Aunt Lily's house that he'd never really looked at, the way his father had avoided the beach for all these years, the familiar features he'd been too angry to recognize in Richardson's face. It all suddenly made sense. "My son," Richardson continued, looking directly at Max, grew up to be the young man who's been fighting so hard to protect what his mother and I once loved. I've spent weeks watching him defend this place, watching him form the same connection with these waters that we once had, without knowing I was fighting against everything his mother would have stood for. The room erupted in murmurs as people made the connection. Max sat frozen, memories flooding back, fragments of early childhood, a woman's laugh, the feeling of small hands holding him up in gentle waves. Lily reached over and gripped his hand, her own tears falling freely. "I came here to build something lasting," Richardson said, "but I realized I've been trying to bury the past instead of honoring it. So today, I'm not just announcing the cancellation of the Malibu Shores Resort project. I'm announcing the creation of the Maria Richardson Marine Sanctuary, named for the woman who taught me, and through her love, taught our son to listen to the ocean's voice." Max found himself standing, though he didn't remember deciding to do so. 20 years of absence and anger collided with understanding and an unexpected sense of completion. His father stepped down from the podium, and for a moment, they stood facing each other in front of the stunned crowd. "I saw why." "Oh, you," Richardson, his father, said quietly. "That day with Sammy, I was walking the beach, fighting with myself about the project, and I saw you rescue that dolphin. You were so much like your mother, showing the same gentle patience, the same connection to the sea. I couldn't face you then, but watching you these past months, seeing you fight for this place, I couldn't hide anymore." Outside, as if on cue, they heard excited shouts from the beach. Through the community center's windows, they could see Sammy and his entire pod performing a spectacular series of leaps and spins in the golden light of sunset. The sight drew everyone outside, where they stood watching the impromptu celebration. "Your mother used to say that the ocean never takes without giving something back," his father said, standing beside Max as they watched the dolphins play. "I forgot that for a long time. Thank you for helping me remember." Max felt Lily's arm around his shoulders, saw the proud tears in her eyes. His aunt, who had become his sister, who had raised him to be strong enough for this moment. The crowd around them began to disperse, heading home with the news that their beach would remain unspoiled. But Max stayed, watching the dolphins with his newly restored family. "Sometimes," he said, echoing the words he'd told the children weeks ago, "the kindness you show comes back to you in ways you never expect." Sammy breached one final time, water streaming from his scarred tail, a testament to healing, to connection, and to the power of returning home.